Standing in the marble lobby of TechForward Solutions at 8:30 on a Monday morning, watching my former boss Rick Thompson clear out his corner office while security guards supervised every box he packed, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. The same man who had humiliated me in front of 200 colleagues just 6 weeks ago was now reduced to asking permission to take his personal coffee mug. But this story isn't about revenge. It's about what happens when someone pushes the wrong person too far and discovers that the quiet, dependable employee they've been tormenting actually holds all the cards. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 6 weeks earlier, I thought I had finally found my place in the corporate world. My name is Emma Rodriguez, and at 29, I had built what most people would consider a solid career foundation in Austin's thriving tech scene. As a senior project manager at TechForward Solutions, I was responsible for overseeing the development of healthcare software that helped hospitals manage patient data more efficiently. It wasn't the most glamorous job in tech, but it was meaningful work that actually helped people, and I was good at it. TechForward occupied 3 floors of a sleek glass building in downtown Austin, complete with the requisite ping-pong tables, craft beer on tap, and motivational posters about innovation and disruption. The company had grown from a scrappy startup to a mid-sized corporation with over 200 employees, and they were preparing for an IPO that would supposedly make millionaires out of anyone who had stuck around long enough to accumulate significant stock options. I had been there for 5 years, starting as a junior project coordinator and working my way up through sheer determination and an obsessive attention to detail that my colleagues sometimes found annoying but management seemed to appreciate. My direct supervisor was Rick Thompson, though everyone called him Rick. At 42, Rick was the kind of man who wore expensive suits to show off his success but always seemed to have food stains on his ties by lunchtime. He had joined TechForward 3 years ago as VP of Operations, brought in from a larger corporation to help guide the company through its transition from startup culture to corporate structure. Rick was charming when he needed to be, especially around senior executives and important clients, but he had a way of making the people who worked under him feel small and inadequate. From my first week reporting to Rick, I sensed that he didn't quite know what to do with me. I wasn't the typical tech bro who responded well to aggressive management tactics and competitive workplace dynamics. I was methodical, thorough, and I asked questions when processes didn't make sense. I kept detailed records of project timelines, budget allocations, and team communications because I had learned early in my career that documentation was the only way to protect yourself when things went wrong. Rick seemed to interpret my careful approach as a challenge to his authority, and he developed a habit of undermining my decisions in meetings and questioning my judgment in front of other team members. The friction between us had been building for months, but I attributed it to normal workplace personality clashes. Rick was under pressure to deliver results as the company prepared for its IPO, and I figured his micromanagement and occasional sharp comments were just stress responses. I had survived difficult bosses before, and I knew that keeping my head down and focusing on delivering excellent work was usually the best strategy for outlasting temporary management problems. What I didn't realize was that Rick had been systematically positioning himself to take credit for the success of projects I managed while simultaneously undermining my reputation with senior leadership. He had a talent for presenting my ideas as his own innovations during executive meetings while framing any problems or delays as evidence of my poor management skills. It was a sophisticated form of workplace sabotage that I was too focused on my actual work to recognize until it was almost too late. The annual TechForward holiday party was scheduled for December 15th at the Driskill Hotel, Austin's most prestigious historic venue. The company had rented the entire ballroom for an evening of dinner, dancing, and celebration of what had been a record-breaking year for revenue and client acquisition. Attendance wasn't technically mandatory, but everyone understood that showing up was part of being a team player, especially with the IPO announcement expected in the new year. I had mixed feelings about company parties in general. The forced socialization and artificial camaraderie always felt awkward to me, but I also recognized that these events were important for building relationships with colleagues and demonstrating my commitment to the company culture. I spent considerable time choosing an outfit that struck the right balance between professional and festive, settling on a navy blue dress that was elegant without being too formal and comfortable enough to survive several hours of networking and small talk. The Driskill's ballroom was decorated with string lights and winter greenery, creating an atmosphere that was sophisticated without being ostentatious. Round tables surrounded a dance floor, and a jazz trio provided background music while bartenders served craft cocktails and local beer. The energy in the room was optimistic and celebratory, with employees from different departments mingling and executives making the rounds to thank people for their hard work throughout the year. I found myself at a table with Alex Chen, my closest colleague and the person I trusted most at TechForward. Alex was a software engineer who had started at the company around the same time I did, and we had developed a friendship based on our shared experiences navigating corporate politics and our mutual appreciation for Mexican food and true crime podcasts. Alex was one of the few people who had noticed Rick's pattern of taking credit for my work, and he had become increasingly frustrated watching me tolerate behavior that he considered completely unacceptable. The evening progressed smoothly through dinner and the usual round of speeches from senior executives. Our CEO, Michael Harrison, gave an inspiring talk about the company's growth and the exciting opportunities that lay ahead with the planned IPO. Several department heads were recognized for their contributions to the company's success, and the atmosphere was genuinely positive and forward-looking. Then Rick Thompson took the microphone. He had been drinking steadily throughout the evening, and I could see from his flushed face and slightly unsteady posture that he was well beyond his usual professional demeanor. Rick began his remarks by thanking his operations team for their dedication and hard work, but there was an edge to his voice that made me immediately uncomfortable. He started making jokes about the challenges of managing different personality types and the importance of strong leadership in keeping projects on track. I should have recognized the warning signs, but I was distracted by a conversation with Karen Williams, our Chief Technology Officer, who had stopped by our table to compliment my work on the latest hospital management system rollout. Karen was one of the most respected executives at TechForward, and her recognition meant more to me than any formal performance review. We were discussing potential improvements to our development process when Rick's voice suddenly became louder and more focused. Speaking of project management, Rick announced to the room, his voice carrying clearly over the jazz trio, "I want to take a moment to address some of the challenges we've faced this year in maintaining professional standards and accountability." The room began to quiet as people sensed that Rick's remarks were taking an unexpected turn. I looked up from my conversation with Karen to see Rick standing at the front of the room, microphone in hand, scanning the crowd with the predatory expression of someone who had been waiting for this moment. "Now, I know we're all here to celebrate," Rick continued, "but I think it's important to be honest about areas where we need improvement. Especially when it comes to team members who struggle with accepting feedback and working collaboratively." My stomach began to sink as I realized where this was heading. Alex grabbed my arm under the table, his expression reflecting the same growing horror I was feeling. Karen Williams had stopped mid-sentence and was watching Rick with obvious concern. "For example," Rick said, turning to look directly at me across the ballroom, "we have some employees who think that keeping excessive documentation and questioning every decision is the same thing as being thorough and professional." The room was now completely silent except for the jazz trio, who seemed unaware that the evening had taken a dramatic turn. 200 pairs of eyes followed Rick's gaze to where I was sitting, and I felt my face flush with embarrassment and anger. "Emma Rodriguez," Rick announced, gesturing toward me with his drink, "has been with us for 5 years, and in that time, she's developed quite a reputation for being, shall we say, difficult to work with. Always asking questions, always wanting everything in writing, always acting like she knows better than her supervisors." I felt frozen in my chair, unable to process what was happening. This wasn't casual workplace criticism or constructive feedback delivered at an inappropriate time. This was a deliberate, public humiliation designed to destroy my professional reputation in front of the entire company. "Now, I've tried to work with Emma," Rick continued, clearly enjoying the attention and the visible discomfort he was causing. "But some people just can't seem to understand that teamwork means trusting your leaders and following direction without constantly challenging every decision." Alex was whispering urgently in my ear, encouraging me to leave, but I couldn't move. Karen Williams was staring at Rick with obvious disgust, and I could see other executives at nearby tables looking equally appalled by what they were witnessing. "So I want to take this opportunity," Rick announced, raising his glass in a mock toast, "to remind everyone here about the importance of professional humility and the dangers of letting ambition override good judgment. Some people think that being meticulous is the same thing as being smart, but real leadership requires knowing when to trust your team and when to follow direction." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The evidence was all there, carefully documented and organized in the same compulsive detail that Rick had mocked just hours earlier. Purchase orders that didn't match project requirements, expense reports that included personal meals and entertainment, budget transfers that violated company policy, and a series of emails where Rick explicitly instructed team members to process invoices without proper approvals. By 3 in the morning, I had compiled a comprehensive dossier of Rick's misconduct that painted a picture of systematic fraud and management abuse. The documentation was meticulous, cross-referenced, and backed up by electronic records that would be impossible for Rick to dispute or explain away. But having evidence was only the first step. I needed to figure out how to use it effectively without appearing vindictive or unprofessional. The last thing I wanted was to be seen as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge for a workplace dispute. I needed to present my findings in a way that focused on protecting the company's interests and maintaining professional standards, not settling personal scores. That's when I remembered David Martinez, an employment attorney I had met through a professional networking group earlier in the year. David specialized in workplace harassment and corporate compliance issues, and he had impressed me with his practical approach to resolving employment disputes without resorting to lengthy litigation. I had kept his business card in my desk drawer, never imagining I would actually need his services. The next morning, I called David's office and scheduled a consultation for that afternoon. I spent the morning organizing my documentation and preparing a timeline of events that demonstrated the pattern of Rick's behavior over the past 18 months. When I met with David in his West Austin office, I was nervous but determined to present my case as professionally and objectively as possible. David listened carefully as I explained the situation, reviewing my documentation with the practiced eye of someone who had seen similar cases many times before. When I finished my presentation, he leaned back in his chair and gave me a smile. That suggested he was impressed by the thoroughness of my preparation. "Emma," David said, "in 20 years of employment law, I have rarely seen such comprehensive documentation of workplace misconduct. You've essentially built a prosecutor's dream case against your supervisor. But what can I actually do with it?" I asked. "I don't want to seem like I'm just seeking revenge for being embarrassed at a party." David explained that my situation involved several serious violations of corporate policy and potentially illegal activities that went far beyond personal conflicts or management-style differences. Rick's expense account fraud, his manipulation of project budgets, and his pattern of taking credit for subordinates' work created liability issues for TechForward that would require immediate investigation and corrective action. "The beauty of your documentation," David continued, "is that it tells a story that has nothing to do with personal revenge and everything to do with protecting the company from potential legal and financial exposure. Any reasonable HR department would be obligated to investigate these allegations regardless of the circumstances that brought them to light." David recommended that I request a meeting with HR to discuss concerns about management practices and compliance issues in my department. He suggested that I focus on the documented policy violations and budget irregularities rather than the personal humiliation I had experienced at the party. The public nature of Rick's attack would actually work in my favor, because it provided context for why I was coming forward with concerns I might have otherwise kept to myself. "Sometimes," David said as our meeting concluded, "the people who think they hold all the power make the mistake of underestimating the people they're trying to control. Your boss just found out what happens when you humiliate someone who has been paying attention." The following Tuesday morning, I arrived at TechForward with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. The embarrassment from the holiday party had transformed into something more powerful during my consultation with David Martinez. I understood now that what Rick had done wasn't just unprofessional behavior that I needed to endure or escape from. It was the catalyst that would finally force me to act on information I had been unconsciously gathering for years. Jessica Parker, TechForward's Director of Human Resources, had an office on the second floor with windows overlooking the Austin skyline. The silence that followed was deafening. Rick seemed to suddenly realize that his performance had not received the response he expected. Instead of nods of agreement or nervous laughter, he was facing a room full of people staring at him with varying degrees of shock, disgust, and embarrassment. Even his usual allies among the management team were looking away, clearly mortified by what they had just witnessed. I finally found the strength to stand up, my legs shaking with adrenaline and humiliation. Without saying a word, I picked up my purse and walked toward the exit, trying to maintain whatever dignity I could salvage from the situation. The ballroom remained silent except for the sound of my heels clicking on the marble floor and the jazz trio, who had finally stopped playing and were staring at the scene unfolding before them. Alex caught up with me in the hotel lobby, where I was standing by the windows overlooking Congress Avenue, trying to process what had just happened and fighting back tears of rage and embarrassment. "Emma, I am so sorry," Alex said, his voice tight with anger. "That was completely unacceptable. Rick just destroyed his own career in there." I wanted to believe Alex was right, but I had been in the corporate world long enough to know that sometimes the person who gets humiliated publicly is the one who ends up paying the price, not the person who did the humiliating. Rick was a VP with strong relationships among senior leadership, and I was just a project manager who had apparently been labeled as difficult to work with. I need to go home, I told Alex, my voice barely steady. I can't think about this right now. Alex insisted on driving me back to my apartment in East Austin, and we spent the 20-minute ride in relative silence while I stared out the window at the city lights and tried to figure out what I was going to do next. The rational part of my brain knew that I should start updating my resume and looking for another job, because there was no way I could continue working under Rick after what had just happened. But another part of me, a part that had been building strength and confidence over 5 years of excellent work and professional growth, was furious at the idea of letting Rick drive me away from a job I had earned and excelled at. My apartment was a small one-bedroom in a renovated warehouse building that I had chosen specifically because it was walking distance from some of Austin's best restaurants and music venues. The exposed brick walls and high ceilings usually made me feel creative and energized, but that night the space felt empty and cold. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my couch, replaying Rick's performance over and over in my mind and trying to understand what had motivated such a vicious and public attack. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Rick's behavior wasn't just inappropriate or unprofessional. It was strategic. He had used the company party, with its celebratory atmosphere and relaxed social dynamics, to publicly undermine my reputation in a way that would be difficult for me to address or refute. By framing his attack as constructive criticism about teamwork and professional development, he had given himself plausible deniability while delivering maximum damage to my standing within the company. But Rick had made one crucial mistake in his calculated assault on my career. He had attacked the very qualities that made me excellent at my job, the same qualities that had created a paper trail documenting every interaction we had ever had and every project decision that had contributed to our department's success over the past 3 years. My obsessive attention to detail, my habit of keeping thorough records, my insistence on having important decisions documented in writing, all the traits that Rick had mocked in front of 200 colleagues, had created a comprehensive archive of evidence that told a very different story about my professional competence and his management practices. As I sat in my apartment that night, sipping wine and feeling the initial shock wear off, I began to realize that Rick Thompson had just made the biggest mistake of his career. He had humiliated someone who had been quietly building a case against him for months without even realizing it. I opened my laptop and began reviewing the folders of emails, project documents, and meeting notes that I had been meticulously organizing for years. What I found was a pattern of behavior that went far beyond simple personality conflicts or management style differences. Rick had been systematically taking credit for successful projects while blaming failures on his subordinates. He had been making decisions that contradicted company policy and then pressuring his team to implement them without proper documentation. Most importantly, he had been using his corporate credit card for personal expenses and manipulating project budgets to cover his tracks. I had interacted with Jessica several times during my 5 years at the company, mostly for routine matters like benefits enrollment and performance review processes. She was known for being thorough and fair, though some employees whispered that she was too loyal to senior management to really advocate for individual contributors when conflicts arose. I scheduled a meeting with Jessica for Thursday afternoon, giving myself 2 days to organize my presentation and mentally prepare for what would essentially be an accusation of serious misconduct against a senior executive. David Martinez had coached me on how to frame the conversation professionally, focusing on documented policy violations rather than personal grievances, but I knew that Jessica's initial reaction would largely determine whether my evidence received serious consideration or was dismissed as the complaints of a disgruntled employee. Wednesday passed slowly as I continued my regular work responsibilities while secretly preparing for the most important professional conversation of my career. Alex Chen noticed my distracted behavior and pulled me aside during our afternoon coffee break to check on my mental state following the party incident. "You've been different since Monday," Alex observed as we sat in the small break room on our floor. "I know what Rick did was horrible, but you seem almost energized rather than defeated. What's going on?" I trusted Alex completely, but David Martinez had advised me to keep my plans confidential until after my meeting with HR. The fewer people who knew about my intentions, the less likely it was that word would reach Rick before I had a chance to present my case formally. "I'm just processing everything that happened," I told Alex, which was technically true even if it wasn't the complete picture. "I think I need to have some conversations about my future here at TechForward." Alex nodded understandingly, probably assuming I was planning to update my resume and start looking for another job. He offered to serve as a reference if I decided to leave the company, and his genuine concern for my well-being reminded me why I valued our friendship so highly. Thursday afternoon arrived with the kind of crisp December weather that made Austin feel almost like a traditional winter city. I had chosen my outfit carefully, settling on a charcoal gray suit that projected professionalism and seriousness without being overly formal. I carried a leather portfolio containing printed copies of all my documentation, organized chronologically and cross-referenced by category of misconduct. Jessica's office was decorated with motivational posters about teamwork and company culture, along with framed photos of TechForward's various charity initiatives and team-building events. She greeted me with the polite but slightly cautious smile she reserved for unscheduled employee meetings that might involve complaints or conflicts. "Emma, it's good to see you," Jessica said, gesturing for me to take a seat across from her desk. "I have to say, I was surprised when you requested this meeting. Your email mentioned concerns about department management practices. Is this related to what happened at the holiday party Monday night?" I had rehearsed this opening extensively with David Martinez, and I delivered it with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "Jessica, thank you for making time to meet with me. Yes, the incident at the holiday party is part of what I need to discuss, but my concerns go much deeper than that single event. I've discovered what I believe are serious violations of company policy and potentially fraudulent financial activities that I feel obligated to bring to HR's attention." Jessica's expression shifted immediately from polite concern to focused attention. The mention of policy violations and fraudulent activities had clearly activated her professional alarm system. "Those are serious allegations, Emma. Can you be more specific about what you've observed?" I opened my portfolio and removed the first set of documents, a timeline of Rick's expense account irregularities that I had compiled over the past 18 months. "I'll start with the financial issues because they're the most clearly documented," I said, sliding the papers across Jessica's desk. "These are copies of expense reports submitted by Rick Thompson that include charges for personal meals, entertainment, and travel that have been incorrectly categorized as business expenses." Jessica began reviewing the documents with the careful attention of someone who understood the legal implications of what she was seeing. I had organized the evidence to tell a clear story, starting with small irregularities that might have been honest mistakes and building to more obvious cases of deliberate fraud. "This restaurant charge from October 15th, Jessica said, pointing to one of the highlighted entries. "The expense report lists this as a client meeting, but according to your notes, Rick was out of town that day for his daughter's soccer tournament." "That's correct," I confirmed. "I know he was at the tournament because he asked me to reschedule 2 client calls to accommodate his travel. The restaurant charge was for dinner with his family after the game, but he submitted it as a business meal with a fictional client name." Jessica continued reviewing the documentation, and I could see her professional concern deepening with each fraudulent entry. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously organized, making it impossible to dismiss as coincidence or honest error. "How did you become aware of these discrepancies?" Jessica asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. "As Rick's direct report, I'm copied on most of his expense submissions for project budget tracking purposes," I explained. "I also maintain detailed calendars for our department's client meetings and travel schedules." Over time, I began noticing inconsistencies between his reported activities and his actual whereabouts. This was the moment I had been most nervous about, because I needed to explain why I had been tracking Rick's activities without sounding like I was deliberately spying on him. David Martinez had helped me craft an explanation that emphasized my legitimate job responsibilities rather than personal suspicions. "It's part of my project management role to track departmental expenses and ensure they align with approved budgets," I continued. "When I noticed discrepancies, I started keeping more detailed records to protect myself if questions arose during budget reviews." Jessica nodded approvingly, recognizing the logic of my approach. She moved on to the second set of documents, which detailed Rick's pattern of taking credit for projects and ideas that had originated with his subordinates. "This is more complex than the expense account issues," I acknowledged as Jessica reviewed email chains and project documentation. "But I think it demonstrates a pattern of dishonest behavior that extends beyond financial misconduct." The evidence here was equally compelling, showing multiple instances where Rick had presented my work as his own innovations during executive meetings while simultaneously criticizing my performance in private evaluations. I had documented specific examples where ideas I had proposed in team meetings were later presented by Rick to senior leadership without attribution, often using the exact language and frameworks I had developed. "This email thread from August is particularly interesting," Jessica observed, reading through a discussion about improving our client onboarding process. "You clearly outlined the entire strategy in your message to Rick on August 3rd, but according to these meeting notes, he presented it to the executive team on August 10th as his own initiative. That's one of several examples where Rick has taken credit for subordinates' work while maintaining the fiction that he's developing all the strategic thinking for our department, I said. It's created a situation where senior leadership believes Rick is more innovative and effective than he actually is, while the people doing the actual work receive no recognition for their contributions. Jessica spent nearly an hour reviewing all of my documentation, asking clarifying questions and taking detailed notes on each category of misconduct. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair with the expression of someone processing information that would require immediate and serious action. "Emma, this is extensive and troubling documentation," Jessica said finally. "These allegations, if substantiated, represent serious violations of our corporate code of conduct and potentially criminal financial fraud. I'm going to need to escalate this immediately to our legal department and senior leadership." I felt a surge of relief and vindication hearing Jessica take my concerns seriously rather than dismissing them as workplace personality conflicts. David Martinez had been right about focusing on documented policy violations rather than personal grievances. "What happens next?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would involve a formal investigation that could take weeks or months to resolve. "I'll need to conduct a preliminary review with our legal team to determine the scope of investigation required," Jessica explained. "We'll also need to examine Rick's corporate credit card records and expense account history to verify the financial allegations. In the meantime, I want to discuss your working situation." This was the part of the conversation I had been dreading. Because I knew that filing formal complaints against supervisors often resulted in uncomfortable working relationships regardless of the ultimate outcome of investigations. Given the serious nature of these allegations and the public nature of Monday's incident, I think it would be appropriate to temporarily reassign you to report directly to Karen Williams while we conduct our investigation, Jessica continued. "This would remove you from Rick's direct supervision and ensure that there's no appearance of retaliation or interference with our fact-finding process." The suggestion surprised me, because Karen Williams was the Chief Technology Officer and one of the most senior executives at TechForward. Reporting directly to her would actually represent a significant promotion in terms of organizational hierarchy and access to strategic decision-making. "Karen specifically requested this arrangement when I briefed her on our meeting this afternoon," Jessica added, seeing my surprised expression. "She was quite disturbed by Rick's behavior at the holiday party and wants to ensure that talented employees like you aren't driven away by management problems that should have been addressed earlier." As our meeting concluded, Jessica outlined the next steps in the investigation process and assured me that TechForward took allegations of financial misconduct and management abuse very seriously. She also emphasized that company policy strictly prohibited retaliation against employees who reported concerns in good faith, and that I should contact her immediately if I experienced any form of reprisal. Walking back to my desk after the meeting, I felt a strange combination of relief and anticipation. The first phase of my plan had succeeded beyond my expectations, with HR taking my allegations seriously and even providing protection from potential retaliation. But I also knew that Rick would soon discover that his public humiliation of me had triggered a formal investigation that could end his career at TechForward. Alex was waiting at my desk when I returned, clearly curious about my afternoon meeting with HR but too polite to ask direct questions about confidential personnel matters. "Everything okay?" he asked, though his expression suggested he suspected something significant had transpired. "Better than okay," I replied, feeling genuinely optimistic about my professional future for the first time in months. "I think some positive changes might be coming to our department." Friday morning brought an unexpected email from Karen Williams requesting a meeting to discuss my new reporting relationship and potential projects I would be working on under her supervision. The message was professional and welcoming, but I detected an undertone of urgency that suggested the investigation into Rick's conduct was moving more quickly than I had anticipated. Karen's corner office was significantly larger and more elegantly appointed than Jessica's, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of downtown Austin and the Colorado River. She had decorated the space with modern art and high-end furniture that reflected both her senior position and her personal aesthetic sense. "Emma, please sit down," Karen said, gesturing toward a comfortable seating area away from her desk. "I want to discuss your transition to my team and some exciting opportunities one think you'll find interesting." Karen's directness and warmth immediately put me at ease, and I could see why she was so respected throughout the organization. She had a reputation for developing talent and advocating for employees who demonstrated exceptional competence and integrity. "First, I want to address what happened at the holiday party," Karen continued. "Rick's behavior was completely unacceptable and doesn't reflect the values or professional standards we expect from leadership at TechForward. You handled an impossible situation with remarkable grace, and I want you to know that his actions will have consequences. The validation from someone at Karen's level meant more to me than I could adequately express. For days, I had been replaying Rick's public attack and wondering if there was something I could have done differently to avoid the humiliation. Hearing Karen explicitly condemn his behavior helped me understand that the problem had never been my professional performance or approach to teamwork. "Thank you," I said simply. "It's been a difficult week, but I'm grateful for the support I've received from HR and from you." "Jessica briefed me on your meeting yesterday," Karen said, confirming what I had suspected about the coordination between different departments in responding to my allegations. "Your documentation of Rick's conduct is extraordinary, and it's raised serious concerns about governance and oversight in our operations department." Karen went on to explain that my evidence had triggered an immediate review of all expense accounts and project budgets under Rick's supervision. The preliminary findings had already identified additional irregularities beyond what I had documented, suggesting that Rick's misconduct was even more extensive than my investigation had revealed. "We're also conducting interviews with other employees in your department to determine if Rick's inappropriate behavior extended beyond what you experienced," Karen added. "Several people have already come forward with their own concerns about his management style and decision-making." This news didn't surprise me, because I had observed Rick's condescending treatment of other team members over the years. What surprised me was learning that other employees had been documenting their own concerns but hadn't felt safe bringing them to HR's attention until my formal complaint had opened the door for broader discussions about departmental culture. "Now, let's talk about your future here at TechForward," Karen said, shifting the conversation toward more positive topics. "I've been reviewing your project history and performance evaluations, and I'm impressed by both the quality of your work and your leadership potential. I'd like to offer you a position as Senior Director of Product Strategy, reporting directly to me." The promotion offer was so unexpected that I needed a moment to process what Karen had said. Senior Director was 2 levels above my current position, with significantly increased responsibility for strategic planning and budget oversight. It was the kind of advancement that would normally take years to achieve through traditional career progression. The role would involve leading our product development roadmap for the next phase of company growth, Karen explained. "You'd be working directly with our executive team to identify new market opportunities and coordinate development efforts across multiple product lines. It's exactly the kind of strategic thinking and project management expertise that you've been demonstrating in your current role." I accepted Karen's offer immediately, recognizing that it represented not just career advancement but validation that my professional skills and judgment were valued by senior leadership. The promotion would also provide protection from any potential backlash from Rick's allies within the organization, because Karen's direct reports were essentially untouchable by middle management politics. As our meeting concluded, Karen mentioned that the investigation into Rick's conduct was likely to be completed within the next week, and that significant organizational changes would be announced before the end of the year. She didn't provide specific details, but her tone suggested that Rick's career at TechForward was effectively over. Walking back to my desk to begin the transition to my new role, I reflected on how dramatically my professional situation had changed in just 3 days. The humiliation Rick had intended to destroy my career had instead become the catalyst for the most significant advancement I had ever experienced. His attack had forced me to act on evidence I might have otherwise kept to myself, and that action had led to opportunities one could never have anticipated. Alex was waiting with coffee and congratulations when I returned, having already heard through the office gossipivine that I had been promoted to Karen's team. His excitement for my success was genuine and infectious, and I realized how fortunate I was to have colleagues who celebrated my achievements rather than resenting them. "This is incredible, Emma," Alex said as we sat in the break room discussing my new responsibilities. "You've gone from being publicly humiliated to getting the promotion everyone in the company would want. How does it feel?" "Surreal," I admitted. 3 days ago, I thought my career here was over. Now I'm going to be working on strategic planning for our IPO preparation. It's almost too much to process." What I didn't tell Alex was that the most satisfying part of the situation wasn't the promotion or the salary increase, though both were certainly welcome. The most satisfying part was knowing that Rick's attempt to destroy my reputation had backfired so spectacularly that he had essentially destroyed his own career instead. The documentation he had mocked as obsessive perfectionism had become the evidence that would end his time at TechForward, while the qualities he had attacked as professional weaknesses had been recognized by senior leadership as exactly the skills they needed for their most important strategic initiatives. Monday morning brought the news that everyone in the office had been anticipating. Rick Thompson had been placed on administrative leave pending the completion of the investigation into his conduct. Jessica Parker sent a brief email to all operations department employees announcing that Karen Williams would be assuming oversight of the department's activities until permanent leadership changes could be implemented. The email didn't provide details about the investigation or Rick's specific violations, but the timing and coordination with my promotion made it clear that my allegations had been substantiated and were being taken seriously at the highest levels of the organization. The relief among my former colleagues was immediately apparent, with several people stopping by my new office to congratulate me on my promotion and to express their gratitude that someone had finally addressed Rick's behavior. Over the next few days, I learned from various sources that Rick's expense account fraud had been even more extensive than my documentation had revealed. The company's investigation had uncovered nearly $50,000 in fraudulent charges over the past 2 years, along with budget manipulations that had hidden cost overruns and project delays that should have been reported to senior management. More damaging to Rick's reputation than the financial fraud was the discovery that his pattern of taking credit for subordinates' work had extended throughout his tenure at TechForward. Multiple employees had come forward with evidence of their ideas being appropriated and their contributions minimized in performance evaluations and promotion decisions. The investigation had also revealed that Rick's public attack on me at the holiday party was not an isolated incident of poor judgment, but rather the culmination of a systematic campaign to undermine my credibility and professional standing. Several colleagues had reported witnessing Rick make disparaging comments about my work ethic and competence in meetings where I wasn't present, often contradicting his official performance evaluations that rated my work as exemplary. By Thursday of that week, the investigation was complete and Rick Thompson had been terminated for cause. His departure was announced in a brief company-wide email that cited violations of corporate conduct policies without providing specific details. The message also announced my permanent appointment as Senior Director of Product Strategy and Karen Williams' expanded role in overseeing the restructured operations department. The speed and decisiveness of TechForward's response to my allegations exceeded my most optimistic expectations. David Martinez had warned me that corporate investigations often dragged on for months, with uncertain outcomes and potential negative consequences for whistleblowers. Instead, I had seen a week-long process that resulted in the removal of a problematic executive and my own promotion to a senior leadership position. Sitting in my new office on Friday afternoon, reviewing strategic planning documents for TechForward's IPO preparation, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. Rick's public humiliation had been intended to damage my reputation so severely that I would either resign or be marginalized within the organization. Instead, it had forced me to confront evidence of his misconduct that I had been unconsciously collecting for years, and that evidence had led to his downfall and my advancement. The irony was perfect and poetic. Rick had attacked the very qualities that made me effective at my job, not realizing that those same qualities had created a comprehensive record of his own failures and violations. His attempt to portray my attention to detail and insistence on documentation as professional weaknesses had backfired when those traits became the foundation for his termination and my promotion. As I prepared to leave the office for the weekend, I received a text message from an unknown number that simply said, "I know what you did. This isn't over." The message was clearly from Rick, and it suggested that his departure from TechForward hadn't diminished his anger or his desire for revenge. But as I looked around my new office and considered the support I had received from Karen Williams and the HR department, I realized that Rick's threats no longer carried the power they once might have. I was now protected by senior leadership, armed with legal documentation of his misconduct, and positioned within the organization in a way that made me essentially immune to his retaliation. I deleted the message and gathered my things, looking forward to a weekend of celebration and planning for the exciting challenges that lay ahead in my new role. Rick Thompson had taught me valuable lessons about workplace politics and the importance of documenting everything, but his most important lesson was that sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up giving you exactly what you need to build something better. The following Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp January air that made Austin feel renewed and full of possibility. I had spent the weekend settling into my new role as Senior Director of Product Strategy, reviewing strategic documents and preparing for what would be my first major presentation to the executive leadership team. Karen Williams had scheduled a quarterly planning meeting for Tuesday afternoon, and she wanted me to present my analysis of our product development roadmap for the upcoming IPO launch. What I didn't know was that Rick Thompson had spent his weekend consulting with his own attorney and plotting what he apparently believed would be a dramatic comeback that would restore his reputation and destroy mine. The text message he had sent me Friday evening was apparently just the opening move in a campaign he had convinced himself would succeed despite the overwhelming evidence of his misconduct. I arrived at the office early Monday morning to find an email from Jessica Parker, requesting an urgent meeting before the start of the business day. The subject line read, "New developments requiring immediate discussion," and the tone suggested that something significant had occurred over the weekend that would affect the ongoing situation with Rick's termination. Jessica's office felt different. That morning, charged with an energy that suggested important decisions were being made at the highest levels of the organization. She greeted me with the focused expression of someone dealing with a crisis that required careful navigation. "Emma, thank you for coming in early," Jessica said as I took my seat across from her desk. "We've had some interesting developments over the weekend that I need to discuss with you before they become public knowledge." She handed me a thick manila folder containing what appeared to be legal documents and correspondence from an outside law firm. The letterhead identified the sender as Morrison, Klein & Associates, a prominent Austin employment law firm that specialized in executive disputes and corporate litigation. Rick Thompson has retained legal counsel and is threatening to file a wrongful termination lawsuit against TechForward, Jessica explained as I reviewed the initial pages of the correspondence. His attorney is claiming that Rick's termination was based on false allegations from a disgruntled employee seeking revenge for legitimate performance management. The irony of Rick's legal strategy was immediately apparent to me. He was essentially arguing that my evidence of his misconduct was fabricated or misrepresented, while simultaneously admitting that he had indeed been managing my performance in ways that might justify my seeking revenge. His attorney was trying to have it both ways, portraying Rick as both an innocent victim and a justified disciplinarian. "What specific claims is he making?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would involve attempts to discredit my documentation and character. His attorney argues that Rick's expense account discrepancies were honest mistakes or legitimate business expenses that were miscategorized due to administrative errors, Jessica continued. "They're also claiming that his taking credit for subordinates' work was normal management practice and that your allegations represent a fundamental misunderstanding of corporate hierarchy and leadership responsibilities." I found myself almost amused by the sophistication of Rick's legal strategy, which essentially required convincing a court that systematic fraud was actually administrative incompetence and that stealing employees' ideas was legitimate management technique. His attorney was clearly skilled at crafting plausible alternative narratives, but the documentation I had provided would make those narratives very difficult to sustain under scrutiny. "More concerning," Jessica continued, "is their threat to file defamation claims against you personally for allegedly making false statements that damaged Rick's professional reputation. They're suggesting that your complaints to HR constitute actionable defamation that has caused quantifiable harm to Rick's career prospects." This escalation surprised me, because David Martinez had assured me that filing good faith complaints with HR was protected activity that couldn't form the basis for defamation claims. Rick's attorney was apparently betting that the threat of personal liability would pressure me to recant my allegations or agree to some kind of settlement that would allow Rick to save face. "What does our legal department recommend?" I asked, though I was confident that TechForward's attorneys would have thoroughly reviewed my evidence before terminating a senior executive. "That's actually why I wanted to meet with you this morning," Jessica said with a smile that suggested she was about to deliver good news. "Our legal team has spent the weekend reviewing Rick's threats and our documentation of his misconduct. They're recommending that we not only reject his demands for reinstatement but that we file a counterclaim against him for fraud and theft of company resources." The suggestion that TechForward might pursue criminal charges against Rick represented an escalation I hadn't anticipated, but it made perfect sense given the extent of his expense account fraud and the potential damage to the company's reputation if his misconduct became public during the IPO process. "There's something else," Jessica continued, her expression becoming more serious. "Rick's attorney has requested copies of all documentation related to his termination, including your original complaint and evidence. Normally, we would provide heavily redacted versions to protect employee privacy, but in this case, our legal team wants to provide everything in full." The decision to share my complete documentation with Rick's attorney was strategic rather than procedural, Jessica explained. TechForward's lawyers believed that reviewing the comprehensive evidence would convince Rick's legal team that their client had no viable case and would likely face criminal prosecution if they continued pursuing litigation. "Essentially, we're calling his bluff," Jessica said. "Our attorneys believe that once Rick's lawyer sees the full scope of evidence against him, they'll advise him to withdraw his threats and accept his termination quietly rather than risk criminal charges and additional civil liability." I spent the rest of Monday morning working with TechForward's legal department to prepare additional documentation that would support the company's response to Rick's legal threats. The process involved reviewing expense records, email communications, and project files that further demonstrated the systematic nature of his misconduct over multiple years. What emerged from this expanded investigation was an even more damaging picture of Rick's behavior than my original complaint had revealed. The legal team had discovered additional instances of expense account fraud, including charges for family vacations that had been disguised as business travel and personal purchases that had been categorized as office supplies or client entertainment. More significantly, they had found evidence that Rick had been manipulating project budgets to hide cost overruns and timeline delays that should have been reported to senior management. This discovery suggested that Rick's misconduct had potentially affected TechForward's financial reporting in ways that could complicate the upcoming IPO if not properly addressed. By Tuesday morning, the legal drama surrounding Rick's termination had taken on a life of its own within TechForward's executive ranks. Karen Williams called me into her office before the quarterly planning meeting to brief me on developments that would affect my presentation to the leadership team. The board of directors met an emergency session yesterday evening to discuss Rick's legal threats and our response strategy, Karen explained as we sat in her office overlooking downtown Austin. They've authorized our legal team to pursue all available remedies against Rick, including criminal referrals to the Travis County District Attorney's Office. The decision to involve criminal prosecutors represented a significant escalation that would effectively end any possibility of Rick quietly resolving his disputes with TechForward through private negotiation. Once criminal charges were filed, the case would become a matter of public record that could affect both Rick's future employment prospects and TechForward's reputation during the IPO process. How does this affect my presentation this afternoon? I asked, wondering if the ongoing legal drama would overshadow discussions of product strategy and development planning. Actually, it makes your presentation more important than originally planned, Karen replied. The board wants to demonstrate that TechForward's operations and strategic planning remain unaffected by Rick's departure and the legal complications he's created. Your analysis of our product roadmap will help reassure everyone that we're moving forward with confidence and focus. The quarterly planning meeting was held in TechForward's largest conference room, with attendance including the entire executive leadership team, several board members, and key department heads from across the organization. The energy in the room was a mixture of excitement about upcoming growth opportunities and underlying tension about the ongoing legal situation with Rick. Michael Harrison, TechForward's CEO, opened the meeting by addressing Rick's termination and legal threats directly, emphasizing that the company had acted appropriately based on clear evidence of policy violations and that they were confident in their legal position. His remarks were clearly intended to reassure board members and senior staff that the situation was under control and wouldn't affect business operations. Now I'd like to turn our attention to more positive developments, Michael announced, introducing my presentation on product strategy and development planning. Emma Rodriguez has recently joined our senior leadership team as Director of Product Strategy, and she's prepared an analysis of our competitive position and growth opportunities that I think you'll find very compelling. Standing at the front of the room with a presentation remote in my hand, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment and validation. Just 3 weeks earlier, Rick had publicly humiliated me in an attempt to destroy my professional credibility. Now I was presenting strategic analysis to the board of directors and senior executives who would guide TechForward through its transition to a public company. My presentation outlined a comprehensive analysis of market opportunities in the healthcare technology sector, identifying specific areas where TechForward could expand its product offerings to capture additional market share before competitors could respond. I had spent hours researching industry trends and client feedback to develop recommendations that were both ambitious and achievable within our existing resource constraints. The response from the leadership team was immediately positive, with multiple executives asking detailed questions about implementation timelines and resource requirements. Board members were particularly interested in my analysis of competitive threats and strategic partnerships that could accelerate our product development cycles. This is exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need as we prepare for our public offering, commented Sarah Chen, TechForward's Chief Financial Officer. Emma's analysis demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of both our current capabilities and our growth potential that will be invaluable during the IPO roadshow. As the meeting concluded, several board members approached me individually to discuss specific aspects of my recommendations and to express their enthusiasm for the strategic direction I had outlined. The validation from TechForward's most senior decision-makers was professionally gratifying, but it also represented something more significant than career advancement. Rick's attempt to destroy my reputation had ultimately forced me to demonstrate capabilities and leadership potential that might have remained hidden if I had continued working under his supervision. His public attack had created the crisis that led to my promotion, and his legal threats had created the opportunity for me to prove my value to the organization's highest levels of leadership. Wednesday morning brought the resolution that Jessica Parker and TechForward's legal team had predicted. Rick's attorney called to request an urgent meeting to discuss potential settlement options that would avoid continued litigation and criminal prosecution. The tone of the conversation suggested that reviewing the complete evidence file had convinced Rick's legal team that their client's position was untenable. The meeting was held at TechForward's offices, with Jessica Parker and 2 attorneys from the company's legal department representing TechForward's interests. I was invited to participate as the primary witness to Rick's misconduct, though the attorneys advised me to let them handle most of the discussion while I focused on answering specific questions about my documentation. Rick attended the meeting with his attorney, and seeing him again for the first time since his termination was a surreal experience. The confident, condescending executive who had humiliated me at the holiday party had been replaced by someone who looked exhausted and defeated. His expensive suit couldn't hide the fact that he understood his career at TechForward was over and his professional reputation was permanently damaged. My client is prepared to acknowledge that certain mistakes were made in his management practices and expense reporting, Rick's attorney began, though his careful language suggested they were still trying to minimize the appearance of deliberate misconduct. We're hoping to reach an agreement that allows both parties to move forward without continued litigation or publicity. TechForward's lead attorney, William Foster, responded with the kind of directness that suggested the company held all the leverage in these negotiations. Mr. Thompson's misconduct extended far beyond mistakes or poor judgment, Foster stated clearly. We have documented evidence of systematic fraud, theft of corporate resources, and workplace harassment that constitute criminal violations as well as civil liability. Any settlement discussion must begin with Mr. Thompson's acknowledgement of these violations and his agreement to make full restitution. The negotiation that followed was essentially a discussion of how much Rick would pay to avoid criminal prosecution and how comprehensively he would admit to the misconduct that had led to his termination. His attorney was clearly trying to minimize both the financial cost and the reputational damage, while TechForward's lawyers were insisting on complete accountability and transparency. Rick himself remained largely silent during the discussions, occasionally whispering with his attorney but avoiding eye contact with me or the TechForward representatives. The arrogant executive who had publicly mocked my professional competence now seemed to understand that I held evidence that could destroy not only his current career but his future employment prospects in the technology industry. The final settlement terms were more favorable to TechForward than I had expected, requiring Rick to repay nearly $60,000 in fraudulent expenses and to sign a comprehensive admission of misconduct that would be placed in his personnel file. He also agreed to a permanent non-disclosure agreement that would prevent him from discussing his termination or making any public statements about TechForward or its employees. Most importantly, for my own protection, Rick agreed to withdraw all legal threats against me personally and to acknowledge that my complaints to HR were made in good faith based on accurate documentation of his violations. This provision would protect me from any future retaliation or defamation claims while establishing a legal record of my credibility and professionalism. As the meeting concluded and settlement documents were signed, Rick finally looked directly at me for the first time since his termination. His expression was a mixture of anger and resignation, suggesting that he understood the complete reversal of our professional positions but remained bitter about the outcome. I hope you're satisfied, Rick said quietly as he prepared to leave the conference room. You've destroyed my career over some expense account mistakes and personality conflicts. The comment revealed that Rick still didn't fully understand or accept the scope of his misconduct, preferring to characterize systematic fraud and workplace harassment as minor errors and interpersonal disputes. His inability to acknowledge the seriousness of his violations suggested that he had learned nothing from the experience except resentment toward the people who had held him accountable. Mr. Thompson, I replied calmly, I documented your behavior accurately and reported it through appropriate channels. The consequences you're facing are the result of your own choices, not my actions. William Foster intervened before Rick could respond, ushering him and his attorney out of the conference room and bringing the settlement meeting to a close. The legal drama that had consumed TechForward's attention for the past 2 weeks was finally resolved, allowing the company to focus on its upcoming IPO and strategic growth initiatives. That afternoon, Jessica Parker sent a company-wide email announcing that all employment-related legal matters involving former executives had been resolved successfully and that TechForward would continue moving forward with its planned expansion and public offering. The message was deliberately vague about specific details, but employees throughout the organization understood that Rick's departure was permanent and that his threats of legal action had been unsuccessful. The email also announced several organizational changes that would strengthen TechForward's management structure and corporate governance practices. These changes included expanded ethics training for all supervisors, enhanced expense account monitoring procedures, and new policies for documenting and reporting workplace concerns. Alex Chen stopped by my office later that afternoon to congratulate me on what he described as the most spectacular professional comeback he had ever witnessed. His enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself laughing about the absurdity of the situation that had transformed me from a humiliated employee to a senior executive in less than a month. "You realize you've become legendary around here," Alex said as we sat in my office discussing the resolution of Rick's legal threats. "People are calling it the most comprehensive takedown of a bad boss in corporate history. You didn't just get revenge, you got promoted and protected yourself legally while forcing him to pay restitution." The characterization of my actions as revenge still made me uncomfortable, because I had genuinely been motivated by concerns about Rick's misconduct rather than personal vindictiveness. But I understood that the dramatic nature of the situation and the complete reversal of our positions would inevitably be interpreted as a satisfying example of workplace justice. It wasn't really about revenge, I told Alex, though I recognized that the distinction might not matter to observers of the situation. It was about protecting myself and the company from someone who was abusing his position and violating policies that exist for good reasons. Alex nodded understandingly, but his smile suggested that he appreciated the poetic justice of Rick's downfall regardless of my motivations. The fact that Rick's attempt to destroy my career had ultimately led to his own termination and disgrace was indeed satisfying, even if that hadn't been my primary goal. As the week continued, I gradually became aware of how significantly the entire incident had changed my standing within TechForward's organizational culture. Colleagues who had previously seen me as a competent but unremarkable project manager now viewed me as someone who had successfully challenged corrupt leadership and emerged victorious from a high-stakes corporate battle. The attention was flattering but also somewhat overwhelming, because I had never sought to become a symbol of workplace justice or employee empowerment. I had simply documented misconduct and reported it through appropriate channels, following the same principles of thoroughness and accountability that had guided my work for years. But the symbolic power of my experience was undeniable, and I began to understand that my story would likely inspire other employees to speak up about misconduct and abuse they might otherwise have endured in silence. The comprehensive nature of my documentation and the decisive response from TechForward's leadership had demonstrated that well-prepared complaints could indeed lead to meaningful change and accountability. Friday afternoon brought a final surprise in the form of a handwritten note delivered to my office by TechForward's executive assistant. The note was from Michael Harrison, the CEO, requesting a brief meeting to discuss my transition to senior leadership and my role in the company's upcoming growth initiatives. Michael's corner office occupied the entire southwest corner of TechForward's top floor, with panoramic views of Austin's skyline and the hill country beyond. The space was elegantly decorated with modern art and technology industry awards, reflecting both his personal taste and the company's success in the competitive software development market. "Emma, please sit down," Michael said, gesturing toward a comfortable seating area away from his desk. "I wanted to speak with you personally about the remarkable leadership you've demonstrated over the past month and the positive impact you've already had on our organization." The conversation that followed was one of the most professionally meaningful of my career, with Michael explaining how my handling of the Rick Thompson situation had impressed not only the executive leadership team but also the board of directors and external advisors who were guiding TechForward through its IPO preparation. "Your documentation of Rick's misconduct was extraordinarily thorough and professional," Michael continued. "But more importantly, your willingness to come forward with concerns about management practices demonstrated exactly the kind of integrity and courage we need in our senior leadership ranks." Michael went on to explain that TechForward's board of directors had specifically requested that I be given expanded responsibilities in corporate governance and compliance oversight, recognizing that my attention to detail and ethical standards could help prevent similar problems in the future. "We're creating a new position of Vice President of Strategic Operations that would report directly to me and have oversight responsibility for ensuring that our management practices and corporate culture align with our stated values," Michael explained. "The board believes you're uniquely qualified for this role based on your recent experience and your demonstrated commitment to accountability." The promotion offer was so unexpected and significant that I needed several moments to process what Michael was proposing. Vice president was an executive-level position that would make me one of the youngest senior leaders in TechForward's history, with compensation and stock options that would provide long-term financial security regardless of the company's IPO performance. This position would also involve representing TechForward at industry conferences and serving as a spokesperson for our corporate governance practices, Michael added. Your story has already generated interest from business publications and professional organizations that want to highlight examples of effective workplace accountability. I accepted Michael's offer immediately, recognizing that it represented not only extraordinary career advancement but also the opportunity to help shape TechForward's culture and practices during a critical period of growth and public scrutiny. The position would allow me to ensure that other employees would never experience the kind of misconduct and abuse that Rick had inflicted on his subordinates. As our meeting concluded, Michael mentioned that Rick Thompson had already begun working with a career transition consultant to find new employment opportunities outside of Austin's technology sector. The settlement agreement included provisions that would allow him to present his departure from TechForward as a voluntary resignation for family reasons, but his reputation within the local business community had been permanently damaged by the circumstances of his termination. Walking back to my office after meeting with Michael, I reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred in my professional life over the past month. Rick's public humiliation had been intended to destroy my credibility and force me out of TechForward, but it had instead become the catalyst for the most significant advancement and recognition of my career. The irony was perfect and complete. Rick had attacked the very qualities that made me effective at my job, not realizing that those same qualities had created a comprehensive record of his own failures and violations. His attempt to portray my attention to detail and insistence on documentation as professional weaknesses had backfired when those traits became the foundation for his downfall and my elevation to executive leadership. More importantly, the entire experience had taught me valuable lessons about the power of thorough documentation, the importance of speaking up about misconduct, and the potential for individual actions to create meaningful organizational change. I had learned that sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up giving you exactly what you need to build something better. 3 months into my new role as Vice President of Strategic Operations, I stood before a packed auditorium at the Austin Convention Center, delivering the keynote address at the Southwest Technology Leadership Summit. The audience consisted of over 800 executives, entrepreneurs, and industry professionals who had come to hear about innovative approaches to corporate governance and workplace accountability. My presentation, titled Building Ethical Leadership Through Systematic Documentation, had drawn the largest crowd in the conference's 15-year history. The transformation in my professional status still felt surreal at times. 6 months earlier, I had been a project manager struggling with an abusive supervisor who seemed determined to undermine my career. Now I was being recognized as a thought leader in corporate ethics and workplace culture, with speaking engagements booked months in advance and interview requests from major business publications arriving weekly. TechForward's IPO had launched successfully in March, exceeding all projected valuations and establishing the company as one of Austin's most valuable technology enterprises. My role in ensuring clean corporate governance practices during the pre-IPO audit had been specifically mentioned in the prospectus, highlighting the company's commitment to ethical leadership and transparency. The stock options that came with my vice president position had vested immediately upon the public offering, providing financial security that I had never imagined possible. But the most satisfying aspect of my transformation wasn't the money or the recognition. It was the knowledge that my experience had created lasting changes within TechForward's organizational culture and had inspired similar accountability measures at companies throughout the technology sector. The documentation practices I had developed were now being implemented as standard operating procedures, and the ethics training programs I had designed were being adopted by other organizations seeking to prevent the kind of misconduct that Rick Thompson had perpetrated. The irony of my current success was not lost on me as I concluded my keynote presentation to thunderous applause from the convention center audience. Rick's attempt to destroy my career by publicly mocking my attention to detail and systematic approach to project management had instead elevated those very qualities into the foundation of my expertise in corporate governance and ethical leadership. During the question and answer session that followed my presentation, a young woman in the front row raised her hand and asked the question I had been hearing frequently at speaking engagements across the country. Ms. Rodriguez, how do you respond to critics who suggest that your documentation of your supervisor's misconduct was actually a form of workplace surveillance that violated professional trust and collegiality? The question was clearly designed to challenge the ethics of my approach and to suggest that employees who document misconduct are somehow betraying their colleagues and supervisors. I had developed a standard response that addressed both the legal and ethical dimensions of workplace accountability. Documentation of workplace activities and decisions is not surveillance when it's part of your legitimate job responsibilities. I replied, drawing on lessons I had learned through extensive consultation with employment attorneys and ethics experts. As a project manager, I was required to track expenses, monitor timelines, and maintain records of team communications. The fact that these records revealed misconduct was incidental to their primary purpose of ensuring project success and regulatory compliance. I went on to explain that employees have both a legal and ethical obligation to report misconduct when they become aware of it, especially when that misconduct involves fraud, harassment, or violations of company policy that could harm other employees or the organization itself. The alternative to documentation and reporting is complicity, I continued, addressing the packed auditorium with the confidence that came from months of refining these arguments. When we choose to ignore misconduct because we don't want to seem disloyal or confrontational, we become enablers of the very behavior that damages workplace culture and organizational integrity. The applause that followed suggested that my response had resonated with an audience that included many professionals who had likely witnessed or experienced similar workplace problems without knowing how to address them effectively. After the conference concluded, I was approached by several attendees who shared their own stories of workplace misconduct and sought advice on how to document and report problems within their organizations. These conversations had become a regular part of my speaking engagements, and I had developed resources and referral networks to help employees navigate complex situations involving abusive supervisors and unethical management practices. One conversation that stood out involved a software engineer from Dallas who described a situation remarkably similar to what I had experienced with Rick Thompson. Her supervisor was taking credit for her innovative programming solutions while simultaneously undermining her credibility with senior management through private conversations that portrayed her as difficult and uncooperative. I've been keeping notes on our interactions and saving emails that document my contributions to various projects, she explained as we spoke in the convention center lobby. But I'm afraid that if I report his behavior, I'll be seen as a troublemaker and my career will suffer. I provided her with contact information for employment attorneys in the Dallas area and outlined the documentation strategies that had been most effective in my own experience. But more importantly, I shared the perspective that had sustained me through the most difficult periods of my confrontation with Rick. The people who try to destroy your career are often the same people who are threatened by your competence and integrity, I told her. When you document their misconduct and report it through appropriate channels, you're not just protecting yourself. You're protecting every other employee who might become their next target. The flight back to Austin gave me time to reflect on how dramatically my understanding of workplace dynamics and professional relationships had evolved since Rick's public humiliation at the holiday party. I had initially seen his attack as a personal assault on my character and competence, but I now understood it as part of a broader pattern of abuse that affected multiple employees and threatened the organization's culture and effectiveness. My documentation had revealed that Rick's misconduct extended far beyond what I had personally experienced, affecting budget integrity, project timelines, and team morale throughout the operations department. The systematic nature of his violations had created risks for TechForward that went well beyond interpersonal conflicts, potentially affecting the company's regulatory compliance and financial reporting accuracy. The comprehensive investigation that followed my initial complaint had uncovered additional instances of expense account fraud, personnel policy violations, and project management failures that could have seriously damaged TechForward's reputation and market position if they had continued unaddressed. My willingness to come forward with documented evidence had prevented these problems from escalating into crisis situations that could have threatened the company's IPO and long-term viability. Tuesday morning brought a meeting with Karen Williams and Michael Harrison to discuss expansion of TechForward's corporate governance programs into our newly acquired subsidiary companies. The acquisition strategy that had driven much of our post-IPO growth required integrating smaller technology firms into TechForward's corporate culture and operational standards, a process that presented both opportunities and challenges for maintaining ethical leadership practices. Emma, your governance frameworks have become one of our most valuable competitive advantages, Michael explained as we reviewed integration plans for 3 recently acquired software development companies. Our ability to demonstrate clean corporate practices and effective accountability measures has been a deciding factor in several acquisition negotiations. The comment reflected a business reality that I had not anticipated when I first reported Rick's misconduct to Jessica Parker. The governance practices and documentation systems that had emerged from that investigation had evolved into strategic assets that enhanced TechForward's value proposition for investors, clients, and acquisition targets. Companies considering merger or acquisition offers were increasingly focused on governance risks and cultural fit, recognizing that management problems and ethical failures could create long-term liability and integration challenges. TechForward's reputation for addressing misconduct decisively and implementing effective accountability measures had become a significant factor in our ability to attract high-quality acquisition opportunities. We're also seeing interest from other technology companies that want to license our governance training programs and documentation systems, Karen added, outlining potential revenue streams that could emerge from commercializing the practices I had developed. Your expertise has created intellectual property that could become a substantial business opportunity beyond our core software development activities. The possibility of turning my experience with workplace accountability into a scalable business product was intriguing but also somewhat overwhelming. I had never intended to become an expert in corporate governance or workplace ethics, but the comprehensive nature of my documentation and the success of TechForward's response had apparently created methodologies that other organizations wanted to adopt. Wednesday afternoon brought an unexpected phone call from Jessica Martinez, an investigative journalist from the Austin Business Journal who was researching a feature story about technology industry workplace culture and the factors that had contributed to several high-profile misconduct scandals in recent months. Ms. Rodriguez, I've been following your speaking engagements and the success of TechForward's governance initiatives, Jessica explained during our initial conversation. I'm particularly interested in how your experience illustrates the potential for individual employees to create meaningful organizational change when they're equipped with the right tools and support systems. The interview request presented both opportunities and risks for my professional reputation and TechForward's public image. Media coverage could help spread awareness of effective accountability practices and inspire other employees to speak up about misconduct, but it could also attract unwanted attention to specific details of my confrontation with Rick Thompson that might be better left private. After consulting with TechForward's public relations team and legal department, I agreed to participate in the interview with the understanding that I would focus on general principles of workplace accountability rather than specific details of Rick's misconduct or termination. The goal was to promote broader understanding of effective documentation and reporting practices without sensationalizing the personal drama that had initiated my involvement in these issues. The interview took place in my office at TechForward's headquarters, with Jessica Martinez proving to be a thoughtful and well-prepared journalist who understood the nuances of workplace politics and corporate governance challenges. Her questions focused on practical strategies that employees could use to protect themselves and their organizations from misconduct, rather than seeking dramatic details about specific confrontations or legal battles. What advice would you give to employees who suspect their supervisors of misconduct but aren't sure they have enough evidence to justify making formal complaints? Jessica asked, touching on one of the most common concerns raised by professionals who attended my speaking engagements. Start with systematic documentation of your regular work activities and interactions, I replied, drawing on the framework I had developed for training sessions with other organizations. Keep detailed records of meetings, decisions, and communications. Not because you're looking for problems, but because thorough documentation is simply good professional practice that protects both you and your employer. I went on to explain that employees who maintain comprehensive records of their work activities are better positioned to identify patterns of misconduct when they occur, and more importantly, they're better equipped to protect themselves from false accusations or unfair treatment by supervisors who might try to blame subordinates for their own failures. The documentation that ultimately revealed Rick Thompson's misconduct wasn't created specifically to investigate him, I emphasized. It was created to track project expenses, monitor timeline compliance, and maintain communication records that were essential to my job responsibilities. The fact that these records revealed systematic fraud and policy violations was a secondary discovery that emerged from good professional practices. The interview concluded with Jessica asking about my long-term goals for promoting workplace accountability and ethical leadership within the technology industry. The question required me to articulate aspirations that had evolved significantly since my initial complaint to HR had triggered such dramatic changes in my career trajectory. I hope that my experience demonstrates to other employees that speaking up about misconduct is not only the right thing to do ethically, but also the smart thing to do professionally, I explained. Too often, people assume that challenging authority or reporting problems will damage their careers, when in reality, organizations need employees who are willing to identify and address issues before they become crises. Thursday morning brought news that would provide a satisfying conclusion to the saga that had begun with Rick Thompson's public humiliation of me at the TechForward holiday party. Alex Chen stopped by my office with a copy of the Austin Business Chronicle's weekly personnel Announcements, pointing to a small item that had caught his attention. Rick Thompson, former VP of Operations at TechForward Solutions, joins Phoenix-based consulting firm as senior associate, the announcement read, providing details about Rick's new position that represented a significant step down from his previous executive role. The consulting firm that had hired Rick specialized in helping struggling technology companies improve their operational efficiency and management practices, an ironic career choice for someone whose own management practices had been so thoroughly discredited. His new title of senior associate suggested that he was essentially starting over at a level comparable to where he had been 10 years earlier in his career. Phoenix is probably far enough from Austin that most people won't know about his history. Here, Alex observed as we discussed the implications of Rick's career restart. But I imagine he'll have to be very careful about his management practices going forward, since any future misconduct would be his second major failure. The geographic distance between Austin and Phoenix would indeed provide Rick with some protection from his damaged reputation, but the technology industry's interconnected professional networks meant that his termination from TechForward would likely follow him throughout his career. Future employers would probably discover the circumstances of his departure during background checks and reference verification processes. More importantly, the settlement agreement he had signed included provisions that would allow TechForward to provide factual information about his misconduct to potential employers who requested references. While the company couldn't actively defame him or volunteer negative information, they could respond honestly to specific questions about his performance and the reasons for his termination. Friday afternoon brought the delivery of advance copies of the Austin Business Journal feature story that would be published in the following week's edition. Jessica Martinez had written a comprehensive piece that positioned my experience as part of a broader trend toward greater workplace accountability and employee empowerment within Austin's technology sector. The article included interviews with other professionals who had successfully challenged misconduct and abuse within their organizations, creating a narrative that emphasized systematic approaches to workplace problems rather than individual confrontations or personal vendettas. My story was presented as an example of how thorough documentation and professional reporting could create positive change while protecting both employees and organizations from ongoing misconduct. Rodriguez's experience illustrates the potential for individual employees to create meaningful organizational change when they're equipped with effective tools and supported by leadership that prioritizes ethical conduct, the article concluded. Her transformation from embattled project manager to recognized expert in corporate governance demonstrates that speaking up about misconduct can enhance rather than damage professional careers when approached strategically and professionally. The positive framing of the article was gratifying, but more importantly, it would likely inspire other employees to document and report misconduct they might otherwise have endured in silence. The practical strategies outlined in the piece could help professionals throughout Austin's business community protect themselves and their organizations from the kind of systematic abuse that Rick had perpetrated. As I prepared to leave the office for the weekend, I reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought me from public humiliation to professional recognition in less than a year. Rick's attack had been intended to destroy my credibility and force me out of TechForward, but it had instead become the catalyst for extraordinary career advancement and the development of expertise that was now being recognized throughout the industry. The transformation had required courage, strategic thinking, and meticulous preparation, but it had also required support from colleagues like Alex Chen, leaders like Karen Williams and Michael Harrison, and professionals like David Martinez and Jessica Parker who understood that workplace accountability benefits everyone involved. My success had been built on relationships and institutional support, not just individual determination and documentation skills. Most importantly, the experience had taught me that the qualities Rick had mocked as professional weaknesses were actually sources of strength that could create positive change when applied systematically and strategically. My attention to detail, insistence on documentation, and willingness to ask difficult questions had evolved from survival mechanisms into leadership tools that were now helping other organizations prevent and address similar problems. The weekend brought a message from an unexpected source that provided a final perspective on the transformation that had occurred over the past year. An email from Natalie Brooks, a former TechForward employee who had left the company shortly before Rick's termination, arrived with the subject line, "Congratulations and gratitude." Natalie's message explained that she had been one of several employees who had experienced inappropriate behavior from Rick but had felt unable to report it due to concerns about career retaliation. My willingness to come forward with documented evidence had apparently inspired her to share her own experiences with Jessica Parker during the investigation, contributing to the comprehensive picture of Rick's misconduct that had justified his termination. Your courage in speaking up created a safe space for other employees to share their own experiences with Rick's inappropriate behavior, Natalie wrote. I don't think any of us would have felt comfortable coming forward individually, but your documentation and formal complaint gave us a framework for contributing to the investigation without feeling like we were making unsupported accusations. The message reminded me that my confrontation with Rick had affected people throughout TechForward's organization, not just the individuals who were directly involved in the investigation and termination process. Employees who had experienced or witnessed misconduct had been empowered to speak up because my systematic approach had demonstrated that accountability was possible when problems were documented thoroughly and reported through appropriate channels. Sunday evening brought a call from David Martinez, the employment attorney who had provided crucial guidance during the early stages of my complaint against Rick. He was calling to update me on recent developments in employment law that would strengthen protections for employees who report workplace misconduct, including expanded whistleblower protections and enhanced documentation requirements for investigating personnel complaints. Your case has become something of a textbook example. In employment law circles, David explained during our conversation. The thoroughness of your documentation and the effectiveness of TechForward's response have created a model that other organizations are trying to replicate to protect themselves from similar liability. David's comments reflected a reality that had emerged gradually over the months since Rick's termination. My experience had contributed to broader changes in how organizations approached workplace accountability and employee protection, influencing corporate policies and legal practices. Beyond TechForward's specific situation, the comprehensive nature of my documentation had demonstrated the importance of systematic record-keeping for both employees and employers, while TechForward's decisive response had shown that organizations could protect themselves from liability by addressing misconduct promptly and thoroughly when it was reported through appropriate channels. As I prepared for another week of meetings, speaking engagements, and strategic planning sessions, I realized that Rick Thompson's public humiliation of me at that holiday party had ultimately become the foundation for a career transformation that exceeded anything I could have imagined when I first started documenting his misconduct. His attempt to destroy my professional reputation had instead provided the experience and expertise that had elevated me to executive leadership and national recognition as an expert in workplace accountability. The irony was perfect and complete, but it was also instructive. Rick's downfall had resulted not from any vindictive action on my part, but from his own systematic violations of policies and ethical standards that existed to protect employees and organizations from exactly the kind of abuse he had perpetrated. My role had been simply to document what was happening and report it through appropriate channels, allowing the evidence to speak for itself and the organization to respond according to its stated values and legal obligations. The experience had taught me that the most effective form of workplace justice isn't revenge or retaliation, but accountability implemented through systematic documentation and professional reporting. When misconduct is addressed through proper channels with thorough evidence, the consequences emerge naturally from the violations themselves rather than from personal conflicts or individual vendettas. Standing in my corner office on Monday morning, looking out at the Austin skyline and the thriving technology corridor that had become my professional home, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction and purpose that had nothing to do with Rick Thompson's current circumstances and everything to do with the positive changes that had emerged from a difficult situation. His attempt to humiliate and destroy me had ultimately created opportunities for growth, learning, and service that had enriched both my career and my understanding of what it means to create ethical and accountable workplace cultures. 2 years after that pivotal holiday party confrontation, I stood in the executive boardroom of Rodriguez Consulting Group, the workplace accountability firm I had founded after leaving TechForward to pursue entrepreneurial opportunities that had emerged from my expertise in corporate governance. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows of our downtown Austin headquarters, illuminating a conference table surrounded by 12 of the most talented professionals I had ever worked with, each of them drawn to our mission of transforming workplace culture through systematic accountability and ethical leadership development. The company had grown from a solo consulting practice to a multi-million-dollar enterprise in just 18 months, with offices in Austin, Dallas, Denver, and Atlanta serving clients ranging from Fortune 500 corporations to emerging technology startups. Our proprietary documentation systems and training programs had been implemented by over 300 organizations across the United States, preventing countless instances of workplace misconduct while empowering employees to create positive change within their own companies. This morning's meeting would determine whether we accepted the most significant opportunity in our company's brief but remarkable history. Global Leadership Solutions, an international consulting conglomerate, had offered to acquire Rodriguez Consulting Group for $800 million, a valuation that reflected both our proven track record and the explosive growth potential of the workplace accountability market we had essentially created. The due diligence process has confirmed every aspect of our operational metrics and client satisfaction data, announced Sarah Kim, our Chief Financial Officer and former TechForward colleague who had joined me during the early stages of building our consulting practice. Global's offer represents a premium of nearly 40% over comparable transactions in the professional services sector. The acquisition offer had arrived at a moment when Rodriguez Consulting Group was experiencing unprecedented demand for our services. Driven by increased regulatory scrutiny of corporate governance practices and a growing recognition among business leaders that workplace accountability was essential for long-term organizational success. Recent high-profile scandals involving executive misconduct had created a market environment where companies were actively seeking the kind of systematic solutions we specialized in developing. Alex Chen, who now served as our Chief Technology Officer after leaving TechForward to help develop our proprietary documentation software, presented the technical aspects of the acquisition proposal with characteristic precision and insight. Global's technology infrastructure would allow us to scale our software platform to serve thousands of clients simultaneously, Alex explained, reviewing integration plans that would expand our capabilities exponentially. Their existing client relationships would provide immediate access to international markets that would take us years to develop independently. The strategic logic of the acquisition was compelling, but I found myself hesitating to commit to a transaction that would fundamentally alter the character and mission of the company I had built as a direct response to my own experience with workplace abuse. Rodriguez Consulting Group had been created specifically to help employees and organizations address the kind of systematic misconduct that Rick Thompson had perpetrated, and I worried that corporate integration might dilute our focus on individual empowerment and grassroots accountability. During the lunch break, I walked alone through downtown Austin's bustling business district, reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought me from public humiliation to entrepreneurial success in such a compressed timeframe. The city's technology corridor had become a testament to innovation and risk-taking, with new companies emerging constantly to address market opportunities that previous generations of entrepreneurs had never imagined. My own transformation from corporate employee to business owner had been driven by recognition that the documentation and accountability systems I had developed at TechForward represented scalable solutions to problems that affected millions of workers across every industry. The positive response to my speaking engagements and consulting projects had revealed enormous demand for practical tools that could help employees protect themselves while helping organizations prevent the kind of liability and reputational damage that resulted from unaddressed misconduct. The irony of my current success continued to amaze me as I considered the acquisition offer that would make me one of Austin's most successful female entrepreneurs. Rick Thompson's attempt to destroy my career had instead provided the experience and expertise that had enabled me to build something far more valuable and meaningful than anything I could have achieved within traditional corporate structures. Returning to the boardroom for the afternoon session, I found my team engaged in detailed discussions about the cultural and operational implications of joining Global Leadership Solutions. The conversation revealed both excitement about growth opportunities and concerns about maintaining the mission-driven focus that had distinguished our company from larger, more commercially oriented consulting firms. The question isn't whether Global's offer is financially attractive, observed Maria Santos, our Director of Client Relations and a former employment attorney who had joined us after successfully representing several high-profile workplace accountability cases. The question is whether integration with a larger organization would enhance or compromise our ability to serve employees and organizations that need systematic solutions to misconduct and abuse. Maria's perspective reflected the core tension that had emerged throughout our growth trajectory. Rodriguez Consulting Group had succeeded precisely because we understood workplace accountability from the perspective of employees who had experienced misconduct firsthand, rather than from the theoretical or purely legal frameworks that characterized most traditional consulting approaches. Our client testimonials consistently emphasized that our methods were effective because they addressed the emotional and practical realities of challenging authority and reporting misconduct, not just the technical requirements of compliance and documentation. Employees trusted our guidance because they knew we had successfully navigated similar situations ourselves, while organizations valued our recommendations because they prevented problems rather than simply responding to crises after they occurred. I think we need to consider whether Global's resources would actually accelerate our mission or whether they would pressure us to prioritize revenue growth over impact, I said, articulating concerns that had been developing throughout the due diligence process. Our strength has always been our ability to understand workplace problems from multiple perspectives and to develop solutions that protect both individual employees and organizational integrity. The discussion that followed explored various scenarios for maintaining our company's mission and culture within a larger corporate structure, including provisions for operational autonomy and guaranteed funding for pro bono services to employees who couldn't afford traditional consulting fees. Global's representatives had expressed willingness to accommodate these requirements, but experience had taught me to be skeptical of promises that might be difficult to enforce after acquisition agreements were finalized. As the afternoon session concluded without reaching a final decision, I scheduled individual meetings with each of our senior team members to gather their private thoughts about the acquisition opportunity and its potential impact on their own career goals and professional satisfaction. These conversations would be crucial for understanding whether our leadership team was genuinely aligned around accepting Global's offer or whether underlying concerns might create problems during the integration process. Tuesday morning brought a call from Jessica Martinez, the business journalist who had written the original Austin Business Journal feature about my transformation from workplace misconduct victim to corporate governance expert. She was following up on recent developments in employment law and workplace accountability that had been influenced by the methods and frameworks Rodriguez Consulting Group had developed. Emma, I'm working on a follow-up story about the broader impact your experience has had on employment practices throughout the technology industry, Jessica explained during our conversation. I'm particularly interested in how your documentation methods have been adopted by other organizations and whether they're seeing similar results in terms of preventing misconduct and protecting employees. The research Jessica had conducted revealed that our approaches had been implemented by over 50 technology companies in Austin alone, with measurable improvements in employee satisfaction, reduced turnover, and fewer formal complaints about management misconduct. Several major corporations had credited our training programs with helping them avoid potential scandals that could have damaged their reputations and market valuations. What's most interesting is that organizations are discovering that systematic accountability actually improves overall performance and innovation, Jessica continued. When employees feel safe to report problems and challenge decisions, they're also more likely to propose creative solutions and take appropriate risks that drive business growth. This observation aligned with feedback we had received from numerous clients who had initially engaged our services to address specific misconduct situations but had subsequently expanded our involvement to include broader organizational development and culture change initiatives. Workplace accountability had proven to be a foundation for trust and communication that enhanced every aspect of organizational performance. Wednesday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to our Austin headquarters. Karen Williams, now serving as CEO of TechForward following Michael Harrison's transition to chairman of the board, had requested a meeting to discuss potential collaboration opportunities that could benefit both of our organizations. Emma, it's wonderful to see how successfully you've translated your experience at TechForward into such meaningful work, Karen said as we sat in my office overlooking the city's thriving downtown district. I wanted to discuss whether there might be opportunities for Rodriguez Consulting Group to work with TechForward on some strategic initiatives we're developing. Karen explained that TechForward's continued growth following their successful IPO had created new challenges around maintaining corporate culture and ethical leadership practices across an increasingly complex and geographically distributed organization. The acquisition of several smaller companies had introduced management teams with different approaches to employee relations and corporate governance, creating integration challenges that required specialized expertise. We've tried to implement the accountability systems you developed during your time with us, but we're finding that scaling those practices across different organizational cultures requires more sophisticated training and change management than we can provide internally, Karen continued. Your team's expertise in both the technical and cultural aspects of workplace accountability could be invaluable for ensuring that our growth doesn't compromise the values and practices that made us successful. The potential collaboration with TechForward represented both a significant business opportunity and a chance to demonstrate that our methods could be successfully implemented at scale within organizations undergoing rapid growth and change. It would also provide a high-profile case study that could enhance our credibility with other potential clients facing similar challenges. However, working with TechForward would also require careful navigation of my personal history with the company and the potential appearance of conflicts of interest or personal favoritism. Our success had been built on objectivity and professional distance from the organizations we served, and any perception that we provided preferential treatment to former employers could damage our reputation for independence and integrity. I'm definitely interested in exploring how we might work together, I told Karen, but we would need to structure any engagement to ensure complete transparency and arm's-length professional relationships. Our credibility depends on maintaining objective standards regardless of our personal or historical connections to client organizations. Karen agreed that maintaining professional boundaries would be essential for any successful collaboration, and we scheduled follow-up meetings to develop a framework that would allow Rodriguez Consulting Group to serve TechForward's needs while preserving our independence and reputation for objective analysis. Thursday morning brought news that provided a satisfying update on Rick Thompson's career trajectory since his termination from TechForward and subsequent relocation to Phoenix. Alex Chen had discovered through LinkedIn that Rick's consulting position in Arizona had been eliminated during a recent round of layoffs, and that he was currently listed as seeking new opportunities in operations management and business development. The information about Rick's continued professional struggles was interesting but not particularly surprising, given the long-term reputational damage that had resulted from his misconduct at TechForward. The settlement agreement he had signed included provisions that allowed his former employer to provide factual information about his performance and the circumstances of his termination, making it difficult for him to find senior-level positions without extensive background checks. Revealing his history. More significantly, the technology industry's interconnected professional networks meant that news of his misconduct had likely spread throughout the sector, creating informal barriers to employment that would be difficult to overcome regardless of his technical qualifications or experience. Senior executives who engaged in systematic fraud and workplace harassment rarely recovered their previous status and compensation levels, even when they successfully found new employment in different geographic markets. I actually feel somewhat sorry for him at this point, Alex observed as we discussed Rick's situation during our weekly team meeting. His behavior was inexcusable, but watching someone's career completely collapse is still sad, even when they brought it on themselves through poor choices and ethical failures. Alex's compassionate perspective reminded me that the accountability processes we had developed were intended to prevent and address misconduct, not to destroy individual careers or create permanent punishment for people who made serious mistakes. Our goal had always been to create systems that protected employees and organizations while providing opportunities for education and behavior change when problems were identified early enough to be corrected. The fact that Rick had apparently failed to learn from his experience at TechForward and had subsequently lost another position suggested that he had not internalized the lessons that should have emerged from the consequences of his misconduct. This pattern indicated deeper character issues that went beyond simple mistakes or poor judgment, making it unlikely that he would succeed in future leadership roles without significant personal development and behavior modification. Friday afternoon brought the resolution of our internal discussions about Global Leadership Solutions' acquisition offer. After extensive consultation with our legal and financial advisors, and individual conversations with each member of our senior leadership team, I had decided to decline the acquisition opportunity in favor of continued independent growth and mission-focused development. The decision was based primarily on concerns that corporate integration would compromise our ability to serve employees and organizations with the kind of personalized attention and mission-driven focus that had distinguished our services from larger, more commercially oriented consulting firms. Our success had been built on understanding workplace accountability from the ground up, and we worried that pressures for revenue growth and operational efficiency might dilute our commitment to individual empowerment and grassroots culture change. I believe we can achieve greater long-term impact by maintaining our independence and continuing to build the kind of organization that we would have wanted to work with when we were facing our own workplace challenges, I announced to our assembled team during our Friday afternoon meeting. Our mission is to transform workplace culture through systematic accountability, and I'm confident we can accomplish that more effectively as an independent company focused on values rather than valuation. The team's response was overwhelmingly positive, with several members expressing relief that we would continue operating according to our founding principles rather than adapting to the priorities and constraints of a larger corporate parent. The decision to remain independent would require more conservative growth projections and continued reliance on internal funding for expansion, but it would preserve the culture and mission that had attracted our most talented employees and most satisfied clients. As we prepared for the weekend, I reflected on how the decision to decline Global's acquisition offer represented another example of choosing long-term mission fulfillment over short-term financial gain. The pattern reminded me of my original decision to report Rick Thompson's misconduct despite potential risks to my immediate career prospects, and it reinforced my conviction that principled decision-making ultimately created more sustainable success than expedient choices driven by fear or greed. The following Monday brought an email that provided a perfect example of why Rodriguez Consulting Group's work was making a meaningful difference in people's lives. Jennifer Walsh, a marketing manager from a Dallas technology company, wrote to thank us for the training program her organization had implemented 6 months earlier, which had given her the tools and confidence to document and report sexual harassment by her supervisor. The documentation methods your team taught us provided exactly the evidence HR needed to conduct a thorough investigation, Jennifer wrote. My supervisor was terminated within 2 weeks, and the company has implemented new policies and training programs that have completely changed our workplace culture. I don't think I would have known how to protect myself or my colleagues without the systematic approach Rodriguez Consulting Group taught us. Jennifer's message was one of dozens we received each month from employees whose lives had been improved by the accountability tools and training programs we provided. These testimonials served as constant reminders that our work had concrete, measurable impact on individual people facing situations similar to what I had experienced with Rick Thompson. The cumulative effect of these success stories was both personally gratifying and professionally motivating, demonstrating that the systematic approach to workplace accountability we had developed could be successfully implemented across different industries, organizational cultures, and geographic regions. Each positive outcome validated our decision to focus on practical solutions rather than theoretical frameworks, and reinforced our commitment to serving both employees and organizations with equal dedication and expertise. Tuesday morning brought a call from David Martinez, the employment attorney who had provided crucial guidance during my original confrontation with Rick Thompson. David was calling to discuss a speaking opportunity at the National Employment Law Association's annual conference, where he wanted me to present a session on innovative approaches to workplace accountability and employee protection. Your experience has become a case study that's taught in law schools and business programs across the country, David explained during our conversation. The systematic documentation you developed and the way TechForward responded to your complaint have created new standards for how organizations should handle misconduct allegations and how employees can protect themselves when reporting problems. The opportunity to address the nation's leading employment attorneys represented both professional recognition and a chance to influence legal practices and corporate policies at the highest levels of the profession. My presentation would focus on practical strategies that attorneys could share with their clients, both employees seeking to document misconduct and organizations trying to prevent liability through effective accountability systems. What's particularly interesting is how your documentation methods have been adopted by HR departments as standard operating procedures, David continued. Companies are discovering that systematic record-keeping and transparent reporting processes actually reduce their legal exposure while creating safer and more productive workplace environments. This trend reflected a broader shift in corporate thinking about workplace accountability, from viewing it as a compliance burden or legal risk to recognizing it as a strategic advantage that enhanced organizational performance and reputation. Companies that implemented effective accountability systems were experiencing measurable improvements in employee satisfaction, retention, and innovation, while reducing costs associated with turnover, litigation, and regulatory violations. Wednesday afternoon brought an unexpected reunion when Alex Chen mentioned that he had encountered Jessica Parker, TechForward's former HR director, at a professional networking event downtown. Jessica had apparently left TechForward several months earlier to start her own HR consulting practice, specializing in helping smaller companies develop comprehensive employee relations and accountability programs. She asked me to pass along her congratulations on everything you've accomplished with Rodriguez Consulting Group, Alex reported during our afternoon coffee break. She also mentioned that she's been recommending our services to clients who need more specialized expertise in workplace accountability than she can provide as a generalist HR consultant. Jessica's career transition represented another example of how the accountability systems we had developed were creating new professional opportunities and market niches throughout the business community. Employment professionals who understood systematic approaches to misconduct prevention and response were finding increased demand for their services as organizations recognized the value of proactive rather than reactive approaches to workplace problems. The informal network of professionals who had been involved in addressing Rick Thompson's misconduct had evolved into a community of practice that was influencing employment policies and corporate governance standards throughout Austin's business community. Our shared experience had created relationships and expertise that continued generating positive change years after the original incident had been resolved. Thursday morning brought the delivery of advance copies of Harvard Business Review's upcoming issue, which featured a comprehensive case study of Rodriguez Consulting Group's methods and impact titled, From Victim to Victor, How Systematic Accountability Transforms Workplace Culture. The article, written by Dr. Patricia Chen from Harvard Business School, positioned our approach as a revolutionary development in organizational behavior and employee relations. Rodriguez's experience demonstrates that effective workplace accountability requires both individual courage and systematic tools, the article concluded. Her transformation from harassment victim to successful entrepreneur illustrates the potential for personal adversity to become the foundation for broader social and economic change when individuals are equipped with appropriate resources and support systems. The Harvard Business Review feature represented the highest level of academic and professional recognition our work had received, positioning Rodriguez Consulting Group's methods alongside established theories and practices in management science and organizational development. The article would likely generate significant interest from business schools, consulting firms, and corporate leaders seeking to understand and implement innovative approaches to workplace culture and employee relations. More importantly, the academic validation would enhance our credibility with potential clients who might have been skeptical of approaches developed outside traditional consulting or academic frameworks. The Harvard Business School endorsement provided third-party verification that our methods were not just personally successful but represented generalizable solutions that could be systematically implemented across different organizational contexts. Friday afternoon brought a personal milestone that provided perfect closure to the week's professional achievements. A handwritten note arrived from my former colleague Maria Santos, who had recently been promoted to partner at her law firm after successfully representing several high-profile workplace accountability cases using documentation methods she had learned during her time at Rodriguez Consulting Group. Emma, I wanted you to know that the approach to systematic documentation and professional reporting that I learned working with you has become the foundation of my legal practice, Maria wrote. I've helped dozens of employees protect themselves from misconduct while helping organizations prevent liability through proactive accountability systems. Your influence has literally shaped my career and made it possible for me to help people who are facing situations similar to what you experienced. Maria's success represented another example of how the accountability methods we had developed were creating positive change that extended far beyond our direct client relationships. Professionals who learned our approaches were implementing them in their own organizations and sharing them with colleagues, creating a multiplier effect that was transforming workplace culture throughout the business community. As I prepared to leave the office for the weekend, I reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought me from public humiliation to entrepreneurial success and national recognition as an expert in workplace accountability. Rick Thompson's attack had been intended to destroy my career and drive me out of the technology industry, but it had instead provided the experience and motivation that had enabled me to build something far more meaningful and valuable than anything I could have achieved within traditional corporate structures. The transformation had required courage, strategic thinking, and systematic preparation, but it had also required support from colleagues, mentors, and allies who understood that workplace accountability benefits everyone involved. My success had been built on relationships and collaborative effort, not just individual determination and documentation skills. Most importantly, the experience had taught me that the qualities Rick had mocked as professional weaknesses were actually sources of strength that could create positive change when applied systematically and strategically. My attention to detail, insistence on documentation, and willingness to challenge authority had evolved from defensive mechanisms into leadership tools that were now helping thousands of employees and organizations prevent and address workplace misconduct. 6 months later, I stood before an audience of over 1,500 business leaders, employment attorneys, and workplace advocates at the inaugural Workplace Accountability Summit, a conference that Rodriguez Consulting Group had organized to bring together professionals from across the country who were working to transform organizational culture through systematic accountability and ethical leadership development. The summit had attracted speakers and attendees from Fortune 500 corporations, major law firms, business schools, and nonprofit organizations, creating a community of practice that was driving innovation and change throughout the employment landscape. The conference had sold out within 3 weeks of opening registration, demonstrating the enormous appetite for practical solutions to workplace problems that affected millions of employees across every industry. My opening keynote address focused on the lessons learned from building Rodriguez Consulting Group and the broader implications of systematic accountability for organizational performance and social change. The speech emphasized that workplace accountability was not just about preventing misconduct and protecting employees, but about creating cultures of trust and communication that enhanced innovation, productivity, and competitive advantage. When employees feel safe to speak up about problems, they're also more likely to propose solutions and take appropriate risks that drive business growth, I explained to the packed auditorium. Workplace accountability isn't just the right thing. To do ethically, it's the smart thing to do strategically for organizations that want to attract and retain the best talent while building sustainable competitive advantages. The enthusiastic response from the audience reflected a fundamental shift in how business leaders understood the relationship between workplace culture and organizational success. Companies were discovering that accountability systems designed to prevent misconduct also created environments that fostered creativity, collaboration, and continuous improvement. During the panel discussion that followed my keynote address, I was joined by Karen Williams from TechForward, David Martinez from his law practice, and Dr. Patricia Chen from Harvard Business School to discuss the evolution of workplace accountability practices and their impact on business performance and social change. Emma's experience illustrates a crucial principle that we're seeing throughout our research, Dr. Chen observed during the panel discussion. Individual courage combined with systematic tools can create transformational change that extends far beyond the original situation or organization. Her documentation methods are now being used by thousands of employees and hundreds of organizations to prevent misconduct and build stronger workplace cultures. The panel discussion explored various aspects of implementing accountability systems, from technical documentation requirements to cultural change management strategies. The conversation emphasized that sustainable transformation required both individual actions and organizational support, with leadership commitment being essential for creating environments where employees felt safe to report problems and propose solutions. As the summit concluded with commitments from attendees to implement accountability systems in their own organizations and communities, I reflected on how Rick Thompson's public humiliation had ultimately become the catalyst for a movement that was transforming workplace culture throughout the business community. The irony was perfect and instructive. Rick's attempt to destroy my career by mocking my attention to detail and systematic approach to project management had instead elevated those very qualities into the foundation of expertise that was now influencing employment practices and corporate governance standards across the country. His attack had forced me to confront evidence of his own misconduct that I had been unconsciously documenting for years, and that evidence had not only led to his downfall but had also provided the experience and credibility that enabled me to build something far more valuable and meaningful than anything I could have achieved within traditional corporate structures. The transformation from workplace misconduct victim to national expert in accountability and ethical leadership had required courage, strategic thinking, and systematic preparation, but it had also required support from colleagues, mentors, and allies who understood that confronting abuse and misconduct benefits everyone involved. Most importantly, the experience had demonstrated that the most effective response to workplace injustice isn't revenge or retaliation, but the creation of systematic solutions that prevent similar problems from affecting other people. Rick Thompson's public humiliation of me had ultimately led to developments that would protect thousands of employees from experiencing similar abuse, while helping organizations build stronger, more ethical, and more productive workplace cultures. Standing in my corner office on Monday morning 6 months after the successful Workplace Accountability Summit, looking out at the Austin skyline and the thriving business community that had become my professional home, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction and purpose that had nothing to do with Rick Thompson's current circumstances and everything to do with the positive change that had emerged from a difficult situation. His attempt to humiliate and destroy me had ultimately created opportunities for growth, learning, and service that had enriched not only my own career but the lives of thousands of employees and the culture of hundreds of organizations across the country. The documentation he had mocked as obsessive perfectionism had become the foundation for systematic solutions that were transforming workplace culture throughout the business community. The lesson was clear and powerful: sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up giving you exactly what you need to build something better, not just for yourself but for everyone who faces similar challenges. Rick Thompson's greatest gift to me hadn't been his humiliation or his subsequent downfall, but his unwitting contribution to the development of tools and approaches that would prevent other employees from experiencing the kind of systematic abuse he had perpetrated. That was the real victory, and the lasting legacy of an experience that had transformed personal adversity into broader social and economic change. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.